April 28, 1943, 5:30 minutes in the morning. In a stuffy room at the United States Naval Intelligence Headquarters in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, 30th D Road, Kenneth Yamamoto watched his reflection in a foggy mirror as a military barber finished shaving his head almost completely, leaving only the short, wispy hair characteristic of Japanese manual laborers. His calloused fingers, scarred from 20 years of working on his family's vegetable farm in California, trembled imperceptibly as he studied the transformations in her face. Kenneth was not a career soldier, had not attended West Point, nor did he dream of military glory. Until December 1941, he was just a second-generation Japanese-American farmer, married to Alice for 15 years, father of 3, growing lettuce and tomatoes on 120 acres of fertile land in California's Central Valley. His life was predictable, honest, American, in every way. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and in a single day, Kenneth went from being an American to a suspect in the eyes of his own neighbors. When the internment order arrived in February 1942, forcing more than 110,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps, Kenneth made a decision that seemed insane to his family. He volunteered for military intelligence service. Captain James Morrison, a 35-year-old recruiting officer, Yale graduate and fluent Mandarin speaker with zero knowledge of Japanese, initially rejected Kenneth's request. For a simple reason: Kenneth was 38 years old, an age considered advanced for active combat. He had 3 dependents, and his loyalty, unfairly, was under suspicion simply because of his ancestry. But Kenneth had something that the American military would discover was absolutely irreplaceable. He spoke Japanese fluently, not just the formal Japanese taught in schools, but the rural Hiroshima dialect that his father had brought to America in 18, complete with slang, idioms, and regional accent that no textbook could teach. Most importantly, Kenneth knew the mentality, the bodily gestures, the subtle social hierarchy, the daily rituals that defined an ordinary Japanese person. He not only spoke the language, he had experienced the culture in his own home for 38 years. Now, 16 months after his initial recruitment, after 340 days of intensive training in hand-to-hand combat, explosives, and infiltration techniques, Kenneth Yamamoto was about to embark on the most dangerous mission American naval intelligence had ever conceived. He would infiltrate a Japanese chemical weapons development facility on the island of Rabaul, New Britain, pose as a forcibly recruited local laborer, and sabotage the production of mustard gas that Allied intelligence believed was being developed for use against American troops advancing across the Pacific. The mission had an estimated duration of 90 days. Kenneth was under orders to survive by any means necessary and to transmit information via hidden radio whenever possible. The chances of success, according to a cold analysis by Colonel William Hendricks, a 50-year-old Special Operations commander and veteran of the First World War, were estimated at less than 20%. Kenneth's chances of surviving, even if the mission failed, were estimated at less than 5%. As the barber finished his work and Kenneth, dressed in the shabby, dirty clothes of a poor Japanese laborer, purposely stained with dirt and dried sweat, he thought of his family interned at Manzanar in the California desert. Alice knew nothing about this mission. She believed Kenneth was in basic training somewhere on the mainland. It was better this way. If Kenneth died, and statistically he probably would, she would receive a vague official training accident notification. The truth about what he was about to do would remain classified for decades. 3,500 kilometers to the northeast, in Tokyo, Japan, March 15, 1943, General Takesi, 58 years old, commander of security for imperial military installations and veteran of the brutal Manchurian campaign, read with cruel satisfaction an intelligence report on American espionage capabilities in the South Pacific region. Yamashita, trained in the best Japanese military academies for 40 years, had devoted his entire adult life to the service of the emperor and considered himself one of the most sophisticated experts in counterintelligence of the entire Japanese empire. Yora's eyes scanned the typed pages with increasing disdain as his deputy, Colonel Hideaki Sato, 43 years old, stood respectfully. The report detailed American attempts to infiltrate Japanese facilities over the past 18 months. They had all failed spectacularly. Yamashita read aloud some particularly absurd passages, his voice filled with barely concealed mockery. Americans had attempted to disguise Caucasian soldiers as Filipino workers in the occupied Philippines, resulting in immediate identification and execution. They had tried to recruit local spies in Java and Sumatra, all of whom were quickly discovered by the Kempatay, the feared Japanese military police. The report also included analyses of the Japanese-American population in the United States, estimated at approximately 127,000 people before the war. The conclusion of Japanese intelligence was devastatingly clear. Americans, in their typical paranoia, had interned virtually all Japanese Americans in detention camps. Those few who remained free were under constant surveillance and widespread suspicion. Therefore, the report concluded with absolute confidence. The Americans had voluntarily eliminated their only potential source of spies who could infiltrate Japanese territory. Yamashita threw the report onto his polished mahogany desk and looked at Sato with an expression of intellectual superiority. He lit an imported cigarette and blew out the smoke slowly. "You Americans are so predictable," he thought, allowing himself a rare moment of satisfaction in the midst of brutal war. "They have the greatest industrial strength in the world," he acknowledged internally. "They can build ships and planes in impressive numbers, that much is true. But modern warfare is not just about mass production of equipment. War is about intelligence, about understanding your enemy, about infiltration and sabotage. And in this, Americans are desperate amateurs." Yamashita explained to Sato in detail why American infiltration was impossible. First, any non-Asian infiltrator would be instantly identified by physical appearance. Second, even if Americans tried to use their citizens of Asian origin, these individuals had grown up in America, spoke Japanese, if at all, with horrible second- or third-generation accents, were completely unaware of proper social rituals, hierarchies of respect, subtle bodily gestures that instantly identify a foreigner. Third, and most important, Japanese culture was fundamentally homogeneous in ways that Americans, with their chaotic multicultural society, could never understand. A true Japanese recognizes another true Japanese by thousands of small signs invisible to foreigners. The way of bowing, the tone of voice, when addressing superiors, the way of eating, of sitting, of walking, of expressing apologies. These are behaviors absorbed from birth, impossible to replicate with artificial training. Yamashita had studied British intelligence during his years as a military attaché in London before the war. He professionally admired the sophistication of British espionage operations built over 300 years of empire. But Americans were improvising cowboys trying to play a game that required centuries of cultural refinement. Sato respectfully asked about the possibility of Americans recruiting Japanese Americans loyal to the United States. Yamashita laughed openly, a rare sound coming from such a stern officer. "Impossible," he declared, "even if such traitors existed," and Yamashita deeply doubted that true Japanese would betray their ancestral heritage. They would be identified immediately. "Our military installations employ forcibly recruited local workers." True, but these workers are constantly monitored, regularly checked, organized into groups of mutual responsibility, where each person watches the others. A stranger wouldn't last 3 days without being reported. Yamashita ordered that copies of this report be distributed to all commanders of sensitive installations in the Pacific, including Rabaul, where a highly classified chemical weapons development program had been underway since October 1942. The message was clear: maintain basic surveillance of local workers. Yes, but don't waste precious resources worrying about ghosts of American infiltration that simply don't exist. Yamashita ended the meeting and dismissed Sato, feeling confident that he had once again demonstrated Japanese intellectual superiority over American ingenuity. Kenneth Yamamoto disembarked in Rabaul on June 3, 1943, arriving hidden in a small fishing boat, OTAD by Australian guerrillas operating on the islands around occupied New Britain. The journey from Pearl Harbor had taken 28 days, including stops in New Caledonia and Guadalcanal for final training and psychological preparation. Kenneth had spent those 28 days completely transforming himself. He didn't just memorize fake coverage, he lived it in his mind hundreds of times until it became his reality. His name was now Kenji Tanaka, 36 years old, born in a small fishing village near forcibly recruited in April 1943 to work on military installations in the South Pacific. Kenji was illiterate, a common characteristic among poor Japanese rural workers at the time, which would explain his inability to read written orders. Kenji was submissive, humble to the point of appearing invisible, exactly the kind of person guards and supervisors would ignore upon initial inspection. Kenneth had studied every detail of Rabaul through aerial photographs, reconnaissance reports, and interrogations of Japanese prisoners. The chemical weapons facility was 3 kilometers from the main port, built inside natural caves, reinforced with concrete, protected by 2 security perimeters with armed guards every 50 meters. Approximately 240 local workers, a mixture of Japanese forcibly brought from other occupied islands, and some equally coerced Koreans, maintained basic operations, transporting materials, cleaning facilities, preparing meals, maintaining non-sensitive equipment. These workers lived in barracks surrounded by barbed wire, slept in raw wooden bunks, received 2 daily meals of rice and dried fish, and were prohibited from leaving the complex under penalty of immediate execution. Kenneth, or rather Kenji, was inducted into the group of workers through an elaborate operation where Australian guerrillas ambushed a Japanese truck transporting new recruits to Rabaul. In the confusion, 3 Japanese workers were killed, and Kenneth assumed the identity of one of them. Forged documents previously prepared by American Pearl Harbor experts made his coverage practically perfect. When Kenneth arrived at the military compound on June 4th, dirty, exhausted, obviously terrified as one would expect from someone who had just survived a guerrilla ambush, he was processed by Sergeant Ichiro Nakamura, a 41-year-old worker supervisor, a brutal veteran of the China campaign known for beating subordinates for minor infractions. Nakamura inspected Kenneth with practiced eyes, looking for any sign of deceit. Kenneth kept his eyes downcast, shoulders hunched, a posture of total submission. When Nakamura asked his name, Kenneth responded in perfect Hiroshima dialect, voice trembling. "Kenji Tanaka, from Onamichi village. I was recruited in April, sir. I beg your mercy, sir." Nakamura asked about Kenji's family. Kenneth, having memorized a complete biography including the names of fictitious parents, siblings, even neighbors from a non-existent village, responded with convincing details, his voice filled with genuine longing that he didn't need to pretend because he really desperately missed his own family in Manzanar. Nakamura asked about work experience. Kenneth explained that he had been a fisherman, thus justifying his calloused hands, but also his capacity for heavy physical work. Nakamura finally nodded approval and assigned Kenneth to bunkhouse number 7, bunk 16, work shift starting at 5 the next morning. Kenneth had passed his first inspection, but he knew the real challenge was just beginning. He would need to maintain this charade not for days, but for months, leaving 24 hours a day among genuine Japanese workers who could detect any cultural misstep, any linguistic error, any behavior inconsistent with his false identity. The first 15 days were psychological torture beyond anything Kenneth had imagined during training. He worked 12 hours a day transporting boxes of chemical materials, cleaning laboratory equipment under constant supervision, carrying 50-kilo bags of activated carbon used in filtration systems. The physical work was brutal, but Kenneth had spent 20 years doing manual labor on the farm, and his body, despite being 38 years old, was still strong and resilient. The real challenge was mental. Every interaction with other workers was a potential test of his coverage. Kenneth needed to be friendly enough not to appear suspicious out of isolation, but reserved enough not to reveal inconsistencies in his story. He needed to demonstrate adequate knowledge of current events in Japan, without revealing that his knowledge came from American intelligence briefings rather than lived experience. He needed to express political views that were patriotic enough not to arouse suspicion, but not so fervent that they attracted unwanted attention. During these first 15 days, Kenneth carefully identified the complex's security structure. He memorized guard, changing times, noticed that more vigilant guards worked night shifts, while more relaxed guards covered the period between 10 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon. He noted that workers were counted 3 times a day, but counts were often inaccurate because the supervisor in charge, Corporal Yamada, 20, was lazy and simply assumed that numbers were correct if they roughly matched the expected total. Kenneth also began mentally mapping the cave complex's interior. He worked primarily in external and secondary areas, but was occasionally sent deeper into areas to fetch tools or deliver messages. During these brief forays, he observed everything: laboratory locations, chemical storage areas, ventilation systems, emergency power generators, containment tanks. Every detail was memorized meticulously because Kenneth could not take written notes without risk of discovery. On June 22nd, the 19th day of infiltration, Kenneth had his first dangerous encounter. A worker named Hiroshi Matsuda, 34 years old, originally from Hiroshima, started a casual conversation during his lunch break. Matsuda was sociable, lonely, desperate for connection with someone from his home region. He asked Kenneth about specific streets in Onamichi, about local temples, about annual festivals. Kenneth had studied Onamichi extensively through maps and descriptions, but maps do not capture the lived reality of a place. He responded with general truths mixed with vague statements. When Matsuda mentioned a specific temple, Kenneth humbly admitted that his family was too poor to attend temples regularly and lived in a rural area far from the city center. When Matsuda asked about the summer festival, Kenneth said that he had left Onamichi at a young age to work on fishing boats in other regions. Each response was carefully calibrated to explain gaps in knowledge without arousing suspicion. Matsuda seemed to accept explanations and continued chatting amiably about his own memories of Hiroshima. Kenneth felt cold sweat running down his back throughout the conversation, but he maintained a perfectly calm outward composure. On June 28th, the 25th day, Kenneth finally gained access to the critical area. He was assigned to a temporary maintenance team responsible for cleaning up a minor chemical leak in the main synthesis laboratory. This was the opportunity he had patiently waited for. Wearing a clumsy gas mask and thick rubber gloves, Kenneth worked alongside 5 other workers under the supervision of Chemical Lieutenant Ruichi Kawasaki, 32 years old, an engineer trained at Tokyo Imperial University. As they cleaned up the spill, Kenneth watched everything. Mustard gas storage tanks, identified with chemical symbols, at least 30 cylinders of 200 liters each. Distillation equipment that indicated production on a significant scale, not just documents left carelessly on a lab bench showing production schedules. Kenneth couldn't photograph anything, couldn't touch documents without obvious risk, but his eyes captured every detail. That night, in tiny coded letters on a fingernail-sized strip of paper, Kenneth wrote a summary report using code that he could swallow instantly if discovered. The paper was hidden within the seam of his mattress. Kenneth now knew that chemical weapons production at Rabaul was far more advanced than Allied intelligence had estimated. They were not just developing weapons. They were producing them in sufficient quantities for potential use against American troops in future offensives. This information needed to reach Pearl Harbor immediately. But Kenneth didn't have access to the hidden radio that was supposed to be buried a quarter of a mile outside the security perimeter. He needed to find a way to escape the compound long enough to convey the message without being noticed as absent. Over the next 3 weeks, Kenneth established a careful pattern of behavior. He often volunteered for unpleasant tasks that other workers avoided: cleaning latrines, disposing of garbage, extra night work. This builds your reputation as a dedicated worker and, more importantly, gave him legitimate reasons to be out of barracks at odd hours and in outlying areas of the complex. Supervisors began to trust him precisely because he seemed so completely servile and invisible. On July 19th, the 46th day of infiltration, Kenneth finally managed to make his first radio transmission. During the night shift of garbage disposal, he noticed that guard at the eastern peripheral fence, Private Takeshi Ito, 20 years old, routinely slept between 1 and 3 in the morning. Kenneth waited until 1:45, then slipped through the hole he had carefully enlarged in the fence over several previous nights, each time covering his modification with branches and leaves. He ran silently a quarter of a mile through dense jungle until he reached the large stone that marked the place where radium was buried. Kenneth dug up equipment, assembled it with trembling hands, and transmitted an exactly 90-second coded message to the American submarine USS Nautilus, positioned 100 miles offshore. The message contained estimates of mustard gas production, location of storage tanks, number of technical personnel, schedules for planned transport of weapons to other facilities. Kenneth dismantled the radio, rebuilt it perfectly, and returned to the compound through the same hole in the fence. He was back in his bunk at 2:30 in the morning. No one had noticed his absence. Kenneth had completed his mission's primary objective, confirming the existence and scale of chemical weapons production and transmitting critical intelligence. But the secondary order was even more ambitious: to sabotage the facility in a way that looked like an accident, not deliberate sabotage, destroying Japanese production capacity without revealing the presence of an American infiltrator. Developing a sabotage plan without tools, without explosives, without access to critical areas more than briefly, was a challenge of ingenuity. Kenneth had only his knowledge of basic chemistry learned during intensive training at Pearl Harbor, and his growing understanding of how the Rabaul facility operated. He noted that mustard gas produced was stored under moderate pressure in steel tanks, lined internally, with lead to prevent corrosion. He noted that the refrigeration system that kept tanks stable operated continuously, with backup generators activating automatically if main power failed. He noted that maintenance workers checked the refrigeration system weekly, but checks were superficial, consisting mainly of visual inspection of temperature and pressure gauges. Kenneth understood that if the refrigeration system failed for a prolonged period, pressure inside tanks would gradually increase. If pressure exceeded the capacity of safety valves, tanks could rupture, releasing mustard gas that would react violently with tropical moisture in the air. The result would be a devastating chemical explosion that would destroy not only tanks, but probably all laboratory and production equipment. Key was to make the cooling system fail in a way that appeared completely accidental. Kenneth spent 12 days studying the system. It was based on electric compressors that circulated ammonia as a refrigerant. Compressors were relatively simple but robust machines. Causing obvious failure would be suspicious. Kenneth needed a subtle flaw that would develop gradually, giving him time to establish a perfect alibi when the system finally collapsed. Solution came when Kenneth observed that compressor lubricating oil was checked monthly, not weekly. The oil tank had a capacity of 8 liters, and the operating manual specified that the level should be maintained above 6 liters. Kenneth realized that if he slowly drained lubricating oil over several weeks, the compressor would eventually operate with insufficient lubrication, overheat, and burn out its bearings. This would cause mechanical failure that would appear to be normal wear and tear, especially in a humid tropical environment where equipment often failed prematurely. On July 28th, the 55th day of infiltration, Kenneth began a sabotage operation. During a night cleaning shift, he used a small piece of wire that he had carefully sharpened to one point to drill a tiny hole, perhaps 2 millimeters in diameter, in the bottom of the compressor's oil tank. The hole was positioned so that oil would leak out very slowly, perhaps 200 milliliters a day. Kenneth calculates that it would take approximately 15 days for the oil level to fall below the critical limit. During this period, he would need to maintain perfect coverage and be prepared for rapid evacuation as soon as sabotage took effect. August 1943 arrived with oppressive heat and growing tension in the complex. Japanese intelligence had received reports of increased American submarine activity in the region. Security has been intensified. Worker counts, once relaxed, have become more frequent and accurate. Guards were instructed to be more vigilant. Kenneth kept an even lower profile. He worked silently, avoided unnecessary conversations, and demonstrated exaggerated submission to his superiors. On August 12th, the 69th day, Kenneth noticed that the refrigeration compressor was making a slightly different noise, a higher vibration that indicated bearings starting to wear due to lack of adequate lubrication. It was not yet critical, but the process was underway. Kenneth transmitted a second radio message on August 13th, informing Pearl Harbor that sabotage was progressing as planned and that evacuation should be prepared for approximately August 25th. On August 15th, 72 days into the mission, disaster nearly struck. Matsuda, the Hiroshima worker who had spoken to Kenneth earlier, was arrested by the Kempeitai on suspicion of being a spy. Apparently, someone had heard Matsuda complaining about brutal treatment of workers and interpreted it as subversion. Matsuda was violently interrogated for 3 days. Kenneth was terrified that Matsuda, under torture, might mention conversations about Onamichi and that investigators would decide to interrogate Kenneth as well. But Matsuda never mentioned Kenneth. On August 18th, Matsuda was executed by firing squad as an example to other workers. Kenneth watched the execution along with everyone else, forced to stand in the scorching sun for 2 hours, while Japanese officers gave speeches about loyalty and the consequences of betrayal. Kenneth felt deep anger, but kept his face completely neutral. The death of Matsuda, the innocent man Kenneth had used as a cover for his own lies, would weigh on Kenneth's conscience for the rest of his life. On August 23rd, the 80th day of infiltration, the refrigeration compressor began to visibly overheat. Japanese technicians noticed the problem and tried to cool the compressor with water, but damage to the bearings was already severe. On August 24th, the compressor finally failed completely, stopping with a loud metallic grinding sound. Backup generators activated immediately, but second backup compressor had also been sabotaged by Kenneth using identical method 2 weeks earlier. When technicians attempted to start the backup system, it too failed after 30 minutes of operation. Laboratory was now without functional refrigeration. Temperature inside mustard gas tanks started rising immediately. Pressure started to increase. Lieutenant Kawasaki, the chemical engineer, immediately recognized critical danger. He ordered the evacuation of laboratory personnel and attempted to drain mustard gas from the tanks into emergency containers. But the process was slow and complicated, requiring specialized equipment. Kawasaki urgently requested transportation of a new refrigeration compressor from another facility in Rabaul, but transportation would take at least 6 hours. Pressure continued to rise. Kenneth, along with other workers, was ordered to evacuate to a safe area at least 500 meters from the laboratory. He obeyed immediately, but mentally prepared himself to escape as soon as the explosion happened. On August 25th, at 3:17 in the afternoon, 83 days into Kenneth's mission, pressure inside mustard gas tanks exceeded the capacity of safety valves. The first valve ruptured with a dull explosion. Mustard gas under pressure gushed out, instantly reacting with moisture in the air. Temperature rose drastically. Second valve ruptured 10 seconds later. Third broke 15 seconds after that. Within 40 seconds, all 30 mustard gas cylinders had ruptured in a devastating chain reaction. The resulting chemical explosion was so powerful that it was felt 5 kilometers away. Main laboratory and 3 secondary laboratories were completely destroyed. 142 cylinders of chemical precursors exploded or burned. 23 Japanese technicians and engineers died instantly. 37 others were seriously injured from chemical burns. Rabaul's chemical weapons production capacity has been eliminated completely. Reconstruction would take at least 18 months, but with war progressing poorly for Japan, the facility would never be rebuilt. In the immediate chaos following the explosion, Kenneth executed an escape plan as guards rushed to the disaster site and workers screamed in panic. Kenneth calmly and walked in the opposite direction, away from the complex. He reached the outlying fence, slipped through the hole he had used earlier, and disappeared into the jungle. Kenneth ran through dense vegetation for 3 hours, using a hidden compass and memorized map, until he reached a predetermined meeting point on the north coast of the island, 10 miles from the complex. There, at 8 o'clock on the night of August 25th, the submarine USS Nautilus briefly surfaced and sent an inflatable boat with 3 team members. Kenneth was pulled from the beach and was aboard the submarine 15 minutes later. As Nautilus dived and began the journey back to Pearl Harbor, Kenneth finally allowed himself to relax for the first time in 83 days. He had lived every moment of these 83 days as someone else, never making a single significant mistake, never allowing Kenji Tanaka's mask to slip for even a second. The psychological stress had been unimaginable. Kenneth would develop nightmares about Rabaul for the rest of his life, waking up in a cold sweat thinking he had said something wrong in Japanese or had behaved in an un-Japanese manner. But he had completed the most unlikely mission American naval intelligence had ever attempted. A 38-year-old Japanese-American farmer with no formal military training until 18 months earlier had infiltrated a highly secure Japanese military installation, lived among Japanese workers for nearly 3 months without being detected, and completely destroyed chemical weapons production capacity that could have killed thousands of American soldiers in future battles. Baikintoko General Yamashita received a disaster report from Rabaul on August 27th 19. Initial report described the event as an industrial accident caused by equipment failure. Investigators at the scene confirmed that both refrigeration compressors had failed due to lack of adequate lubrication. Oil tanks of both compressors showed small holes at the bottom, probably caused by corrosion in a humid tropical environment. No evidence of intentional sabotage was found. All workers were counted after explosion. 3 workers were missing, presumed dead and vaporized by the chemical explosion. One of these 3 missing workers was identified as Kenji Tanaka, 36 years old, from Anami. Yamashita read the report with deep frustration, but without suspicion. He attributed disaster to incompetence of maintenance personnel and inferior quality of equipment operating in adverse tropical conditions. It never occurred to him that Americans had managed to infiltrate an agent for almost 3 months in a facility that he had assured was impenetrable. Concept was simply unthinkable within Yamashita's mental paradigm. Only in September 1945, after Japan's surrender, when Allied intelligence files were partially revealed during war crimes trials, did Yamashita discover the truth. He read the declassified report on Operation Tanaka, the code name for Kenneth's mission. Report detailed the entire operation: Yamamoto's recruitment, training, infiltration, months of undercover life, meticulous sabotage, successful extraction. Yamashita, now a prisoner awaiting trial for war crimes related to the Manila massacre, sat in his cell and reread the report 3 times. He felt something he had rarely experienced in his long military career: grudging admiration for an enemy. Technique and execution were brilliant, but more than that, the operation had exploited exactly the weakness that Yamashita had denied existed: Japanese cultural arrogance. Japanese had assumed that their society was impenetrable, precisely because it was culturally homogeneous. But this cultural homogeneity created a fatal blind spot. When someone managed to penetrate cultural cover, as Kenneth had done, defenders simply could not conceive of the possibility of infiltration. They saw what they expected to see: another submissive, anonymous Japanese worker. Yamashita realized that Americans had won not in spite of their multicultural society, but because of it. They had access to Japanese Americans who could bridge cultures in ways that culturally isolated Japan could never replicate. Yamashita wrote a note in his personal diary that night: "We underestimate Americans not for their industrial strength, but for their human diversity." Each group of immigrants in their chaotic society represented a potential weapon of infiltration that we, in our cultural purity, did not possess. A Japanese-American farmer defeated our most sophisticated security because he was simultaneously American in allegiance and Japanese in appearance and language. We could have produced equivalent. Our cultural homogeneity, which we considered strength, turned out to be a fatal strategic weakness. Kenneth Yamamoto returned to Pearl Harbor on September 12, 1943, after 18 days aboard the USS Untold. He was immediately taken for extensive debriefing sessions that lasted 6 days. Intelligence analysts questioned him about every detail of his experience in rebellion. Kenneth described the physical layout of the facility, personalities of officers and supervisors he had observed, worker morale, safety conditions, technical capabilities. His memory was extraordinarily detailed. He could remember specific conversations, word for word. He could draw accurate diagrams of areas he had only briefly seen. He could estimate personnel numbers with remarkable accuracy. Colonel William Hendricks, who had originally given Kenneth's mission only a 20% chance of success, was deeply impressed. Hendricks recommended Kenneth for the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest American military decoration, but the operation remained highly classified. Kenneth could not receive a medal publicly without revealing the nature of his mission, which would compromise future similar operations. Then Kenneth was informed that his award would be registered but would not be physically presented until the classification was removed, which could take decades. Kenneth accepted this without complaint. He had never done it for recognition. He had done it for his country, and more importantly, to prove that Japanese Americans were loyal Americans, not internal enemies, as so much racist propaganda claimed. On September 22, 1943, Kenneth was honorably discharged from active duty. He received special permission to reunite with his family in Manzanar, where Alice and her 3 children were still hospitalized. Kenneth couldn't tell Alice about the real mission. He said only that he had worked on translation and intelligence analysis at Pearl Harbor. Alice who had lived 11 months of agonizing uncertainty without adequate news of her husband, simply hugged him and cried for an hour. Children, now 12, 10, and 8 years old, barely recognized their father, who seemed to have aged 10 years in 18 months of absence. Kenneth would spend the next 17 months in Manzanar with his family, living in a 6x8-meter shack, working on a farm in the countryside, trying to rebuild relationships that the war had damaged. Decades passed before Kenneth's story became publicly known. In 1988, 45 years after the end of the war, the Department of Defense finally declassified files related to Japanese-American intelligence operations during World War II. Kenneth, now 83 years old, still alive and living in a small house in San Jose, California, was invited to the ceremony at the Pentagon. There, on November 15, 1988, in the presence of the Secretary of Defense, representatives of the Japanese-American community, and surviving members of the intelligence community who had worked in Pacific operations, Kenneth finally received the Distinguished Service Cross that had been registered 45 years earlier. Also receiving posthumous decorations were 17 other Japanese Americans who had served in similar intelligence missions. Although none as audacious or lasting as Operation Tanaka, during the ceremony, General Matthew Ridgway, 93 years old, a Pacific veteran who had been briefed on Kenneth's mission during the war, gave a speech. He explained to his audience, many of whom were too young to remember the anti-Japanese hysteria of 1942, that Japanese Americans had faced an impossible choice during the war. They were treated as enemies by their own country. Their families were in, their properties were confiscated, their loyalty was questioned daily, yet thousands of them chose to serve in the American military. The 422nd Regimental Combat Team, composed entirely of Japanese Americans, became the most decorated unit in American military history for its size and length of service, and individuals like Kenneth Yamamoto carried out missions that were, in many ways, more dangerous than frontal combat, because, if they were captured, they would not receive treatment as prisoners of war, but would be executed as traitors. Ridgway ended his speech with words that made Kenneth, a normally, emotionally controlled man, discreetly wipe away tears. These men and women, Ridgway sighed, proved that Americanism is not defined by appearance, by last name, or by ancestry. It's defined out of loyalty to shared ideals of freedom and democracy. When the nation doubted them, they responded not with anger, but with service. When society rejected them, they defended that society with their lives. This is patriotism in its purest form. Historical researchers subsequently analyzed the impact of Operation Tanaka and the sabotage of the Robal chemical weapons facility. Captured Japanese documents revealed that Japan had planned to use mustard gas in defense of strategic islands in the Pacific if an American invasion appeared imminent. The plan was to use gas against beachheads to cause massive casualties and delay the American advance, while Japanese reinforcements could be mobilized. The Robal facility was designed to produce 70% of the mustard gas that would be used in this defensive strategy. Destruction of the facility in August 1943 eliminated this capacity, just as production was accelerating. Without adequate production capacity, and with increasingly chaotic logistics due to naval losses, Japan was forced to abandon plans for the defensive use of chemical weapons. Military analysts later estimated that if Japan had used mustard gas in battles such as Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and possible planned invasion of mainland Japan, American casualties could have been significantly higher. Conservative estimates suggested that the use of chemical weapons could have killed an additional 10,000 to 20,000 American soldiers and prolonged the war in the Pacific for 6 to 12 months. Thus, a single Japanese-American farmer's mission, alone and unsupported for 93 days, possibly saved tens of thousands of American lives and hastened the end of the war. Kenneth never spoke publicly much about his experience, even after disqualification. He gave a few interviews to historians, always emphasizing that he was just an American doing his duty, not a hero. He insisted that true heroes were men who died in combat, not someone like him who survived. When asked about 83 days of living undercover in constant risk of discovery and execution, Kenneth would simply say that he did what needed to be done. His most revealing comment came in an interview in 1992. At the age of 80, journalist asked how he managed to maintain his disguise for so long without making a fatal mistake. Kenneth thought for a long moment before responding. He said secrecy was not acting technique or perfect memorization of false coverage. It was something more fundamental. He had grown up living between two cultures, Japanese at home and American abroad. He had always felt that he didn't completely belong to either of them. In Rabaul, for the first time in his life, this duality was not weakness, but superpower. He wasn't pretending to be Japanese. He was Japanese, in language, in culture, in body gestures, absorbed since childhood. But he was also American, in values, in loyalty, in determination. This specific combination of bicultural identity was exactly what the mission called for. Soina Sensei, Kenneth said, he was not undercover during those 83 days. He was being more authentically himself than at any other time in his life. Kenneth Masaru Yamamoto died on January 3, 1997, at the age of 91, of natural causes. He was surrounded by Alice, his wife of 69 years, his 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren. Their farm in Salinas had been confiscated during the war and was never adequately restituted, but the Yamamoto family had rebuilt life in San Jose, where Kenneth worked as an agricultural consultant for 32 years after the war. Memorial service was held at the San Jose Japanese Methodist Church, where Kenneth had been a member for 40 years. 236 people attended. Some were Japanese-American veterans who had served in the 442nd or in military intelligence. Some were members of the local community who knew Kenneth as a kind neighbor and wise counselor but had no idea about his wartime service. Some were academics and historians who had studied Japanese-American intelligence operations. 2 were former naval intelligence officers who had worked at Pearl Harbor during the war and remembered the quiet farmer with the intense eyes who volunteered for the suicide mission. Wile on due to Kenneth's eldest son, Thomas Yamamoto, 62 years old, a university history professor, read letters that his father had written but never sent during the 83 days in Rabaul. Kenneth had written these letters knowing that he would probably die and that letters would never be read by recipients. But writing kept him mentally connected. I love my family during the ordeal. Letters were simple, direct, full of love and longing. In a letter to Alice, Kenneth wrote, I think about you every night before I go to sleep. I remember how you laughed when we grew tomatoes together on our farm. I remember your face when our first child was born. If I don't return, please know that every decision I made was to protect you and our children. I couldn't live in a world where my family wasn't free. In a letter to his children, Kenneth wrote, You are young and do not yet understand why some people look at our family with suspicion. But I want you to know that you are Americans, as American as anyone in this country. Don't let anyone make you doubt that. And when you are older, be generous to those who doubt you. Fear makes people act in ways they later regret. Forgive, but don't forget. Thomas finished reading letters with a choked voice, unable to continue. Audience in church was silent for long moments. Kenneth's grave at Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno, California, is simple. Bronze plaque identifies Kenneth Masaru Yamamoto, 1905 to 1997, Technical Sergeant, United States Army Intelligence Corps, Distinguished Service Cross, World War II. There is no mention of Operation Tanaka, of Rabaul, of 83 days of almost impossible infiltration. Visitors passing by the tomb have no way of knowing that the man buried there carried out one of the most audacious intelligence missions of the war. But sometimes, on anniversaries of significant events related to Japanese Americans in World War II, small groups of people come to the tomb. Some are descendants of soldiers from the 440. Some are historical some are simply Americans who learned about the forgotten wartime history of Japanese Americans and want to pay their respects. They leave flowers, small American flags, and the occasional handwritten note. One note, left in August 203, the 60th anniversary of the Rabaul Sabbath, said simply, Thank you for reminding us that appearance does not determine loyalty, that age does not determine courage, and that a farmer can be as effective as a professional soldier when the cause is just. You shouldn't have needed to prove anything, but you proved everything. Kenneth Yamamoto's story is remembered today in Japanese-American museums, in academic books about World War II intelligence, and in some high school curricula that teach about the Japanese-American wartime experience. But outside these specialized circles, Kenneth remains largely unknown. That would be fitting for a man who spent 3 months of his life deliberately being invisible, working behind the scenes, accepting that his sacrifice would never be widely recognized. Kenneth didn't need fame. He just needed to know that he had served his country to the best of his ability, that he had protected American soldiers who would never know his name, that he had helped shorten the war, if only briefly. And perhaps, most importantly, for Kenneth, he had proven beyond all reasonable doubt that Japanese Americans were true Americans, loyal beyond all reasonable doubt. Thousands of other Japanese Americans proved this through heroic combat in Europe. Kenneth proved this through something even more difficult, perfectly disguising himself as the enemy while working to defeat that enemy from within. A German soldier wounded in combat could see the face of a Japanese American soldier from the 442nd and know that he was defeated in a fair battle. But Japanese technicians in Rabaul never knew they were defeated by an American who appeared to be one of them. This strategic invisibility was a triumph of espionage, but also a painful metaphor for the Japanese-American wartime experience, serving brilliantly while remaining invisible, contributing decisively while remaining unrecognized, proving loyalty over and over again to audiences who rarely acknowledged the evidence. Kenneth Yamamoto and thousands like him deserved better treatment from their own country. But they served anyway, not because the country was perfect, but because they believed in the ideals the country professed and hoped that one day those ideals would be applied equally to all Americans. This faith in the face of injustice is a form of courage that no external enemy could defeat and no domestic failure could completely erase.